Over 75 years, so much has been achieved for people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes.
I've had the privilege of working in both New South Wales and West Australian Health Department, so I'm acutely aware of the prevalence rates of type 2 and type 1 diabetes in this country. But more importantly, the work that is needed within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, where the prevalent rates are 4 times that of the Australian population. I'm looking forward to working with the Australian Diabetes Council in focusing on the needs of Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I think the other important part is developing a national strategy that will focus the energy and efforts of those involved in the provision of treatment and services on addressing this major health problem. I think the other factor that's exciting is the possibility and our commitment to working with the Pacific Rim in providing both education and support in addressing type 2 diabetes within those countries.
We started the Parliamentary Diabetes Support Group to raise awareness amongst politicians of the growing prevalence of diabetes in the community. One of our leading professors has warned that if we do not have better public policy to diagnose and treat diabetes, then it will cost the Australian community $23 billion within 20 years. And without good public policy, we will not stop the malevolent march of this terrible disease.
We support the Australian Diabetes Council and congratulate them on their achievements so far, and we look forward to working with them into the future.
Before insulin, diabetes was a death sentence. Since the discovery of insulin in 1921, millions of lives have changed, and the contribution of Australians to diabetes diagnosis, treatment and management has been significant. An essential step was to create the first Australian diabetes charity in New South Wales. It continues today to give a shared voice to those living with and at risk of diabetes and addressing the challenges of the 21st century. The Australian Diabetes Council, 75 years. From earliest recorded history, there was evidence of diabetes, yet no effective cure.
The ancient Greeks were aware that there was a disorder where people passed a great deal of urine and became thirsty and lost weight. It remained that way for many, many years, but things really changed in the 1800s with the discovery that there was a factor that was causing this increase in urine production and the increase in thirst as a result, and that was a fundamental abnormality. It was characterised by both Minkowski and Mering, and then Langerhans identifying the fact of the abnormality being related to the islets. It went on then without further development until the time of Banting and Best and MacLeod and Collop.
October 1920. A young Canadian surgeon, Frederick Banting, wakes at 2 a.m. with a eureka moment and feverishly writes, "Ligate the pancreatic ducts of dogs." Using a small lab at the University of Toronto, 10 dogs and an assistant, Charles Best. In 1921, Banting discovers insulin. By January 1922, the first human test is successful with bovine insulin. Banting and his professor, MacLeod, are awarded the 1923 Nobel Prize. Sydney, Australia, 1921. Harry Adams had just been told that his child had months to live. Frail, tiny Phyllis was only 5, and her life was about to end.
And so he corresponded with Banting and Best by telex. The message came back, "We're not ready, keep her alive." And they did keep her alive for a period of 9 months on a diet of a teaspoon of butter, a lettuce leaf and the whey of junket daily. So she was a tiny little skin and bone child. And Eventually, 9 months later, the first commercial batch of insulin was given to the purser on the old Ronsay, who sailed from Vancouver to Sydney. And when it arrived in Sydney, they went out in the pilot boat and met the ship, got the insulin, brought it back, and in fact injected her on the wharf at Pyrmont. And she has a story then that the best meal she's ever had in her life, they gave her half a Sayo biscuit. They said that she may live till she was 9. Well, she died at 81, 82. She lived with it, she conquered it, and she gave an outward appearance of suffering nothing.
Phyllis Adams Lush proved everyone wrong about her life for 81 years. Advised and assisted by her doctor, Sir Kempson Maddox, the founder of this remarkable charity. In 1935, a brilliant young Australian physician, John Kempson Maddox, set up the first diabetic clinic in New South Wales as part of the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. He decided that both medical professionals and lay people needed information on diabetes.
There was a famous English physician diabetologist who had diabetes himself, R.D. Lawrence, who was going to make a visit to Australia and give lectures. And it was decided they'd invite him to give a public lecture in Sydney. At that public lecture, they'd try and get people interested in forming an association of people with diabetes. And they arranged for the lecture to be given in the hall of the New South Wales branch of the British Medical Association. He and R.D. Lawrence and some other well-known medical identities, plus a whole host of people with diabetes, turned up for this public lecture, and they were locked out of the hall. Because that afternoon, the Council of the New South Wales branch of the BMA had met and decided that it was totally inappropriate for a doctor to give a public lecture to patients about their disorder. So they all walked up the road to Sydney Hospital and found an empty lecture theatre, and R.D. Lawrence gave his talk, and the people got together after the lecture, and the formation of the Diabetic Association of New South Wales was in train.
By the 27th of July 1938, it had become the Diabetic Association of Australia in New South Wales.
It was quite obvious that we would have to form a society or union or whatever you like to call it in the whole of Australia if possible.
Very knowledgeable physician with a great deal of experience and highly respected.
The formation of these organisations has actually transformed medicine.
Post-World War II, Diabetes Australia New South Wales continued, with Sir Kempson Maddox still strongly involved. By the 1950s, type 2 diabetes was clearly delineated.
It's not a single disorder, it's multiple different genes which produce high blood glucose and the consequences of that high blood glucose.
By the 1960s, there was considerable progress, yet inaccurate testing methods had changed little in 30 years.
There was no blood tests for blood glucose in those days unless you went to the hospital and had it done. Urine testing was done with a test tube with Benedict solution in it, 1 inch of Benedict solution. I think from memory it was about 5 drops of urine you used to have to put into it, and then you'd bring it to the boil, not quite to the boil, on a Bunsen burner, and it would change colour according to the amount of glucose you had in your system at the time, and you'd measure that against a chart. Barbaric.
Totally misleading and inaccurate, soul-destroying.
In 1978, Stan and Audrey Clark took their young child, Lisa, on a regular basis to Camperdown Hospital.
When Lisa was round about 10 or 11, she had this massive coma, so she was rushed into hospital.
So with Lisa having difficulty with her diabetes, we sent Lisa with one of these reflectance meters home. In fact, it was so good that they pulled the meter apart, worked out how it worked, and they said we can build our own much cheaper.
We had no facilities or anything, so we did it on our kitchen table. And then the hospital then wanted more and more, so we had to get a little factory. And he got the Order of Australia, and then he got a medal in Geneva. He won a prize on What Will They Think of Next.
What will they think of next?
Stan Clark, the inventor, told us about his invention.
The system is very simple. In fact, the whole system was designed for the use by very young children. Yes, I didn't invent the strip testing system, but what I did was brought it out of the realms of just the highly trained medical personnel and just put it in so a 4-year-old child can operate that.
What will they think of next?
He was always very humble, very, very humble, and he did everything out of the goodness of his heart.
I've got that many letters saying that he'd changed the lives. I'm getting emotional myself now. He was a gentleman, and he was just had a lot of compassion for people. He was gorgeous.
And within 6 months, the whole clinic, with Stan Clark's help, was on home blood glucose monitoring. It was a revolution at the time, and we're talking about 1978, 1979.
In the late 20th century, extraordinary changes took place in treatment, education, patient independence, and the psychosocial aspects of living with diabetes. These are just a few of the outstanding contributors.
Mark McGill is allied health scientist who's been recently appointed as adjunct associate professor in the University of Sydney and is a member of the Order of Australia. She has had an enormous impact on education in diabetes, and particularly educating health professionals and the development of clinical skills in health professionals. This has been initially in paediatrics, then in adult diabetes, and she has led many different programs in countries around the world.
You know, I very much respected Paul for all that he did, because he was a great pioneer in diabetes.
It was fairly awful for people with diabetes back in 1965 because knowledge of the management of diabetes, the understanding of diabetes was poor in the medical profession, worse in the nursing profession, and abysmally poor for the poor patient. So in September 1975, I started a diabetes education and stabilisation centre in Royal Newcastle Hospital, and it was the very first centre in Australia that patients could come to and spend a week. So they had education and stabilisation.
Dr. Martin Solway really, I think he got physicians starting to think about education. Martin was passionate about education, and he did it with Gillian Harris in a brilliant way. You know, they started groups, they got people talking, they started adolescent camps. They trained so many people in Australia and got them to think of their way of providing education.
I couldn't just concentrate on North Shore Hospital. I thought I would go out into the community itself. And we got some invitations from Diabetes Australia in New South Wales. And they said, look, they'd like you to go down and introduce your program to these people in the sticks. They have nothing. And it was like putting light in a dark place, because people were so deprived of any self-management skills or education. People with diabetes aren't pancreases on legs. They're actually real people.
Professor John Turtle was head of our department when I first started working here. He was head of the RPA Department of Endocrinology for decades. And again, he's a world leader in diabetes and highly respected. Was one of the group that started the Australian Diabetes Society. And yes, he's a world authority on diabetes and a very, very good man, a very nice man.
It's so important to have prominent members of the community talking about diabetes, which they may or may not have themselves, but drawing the attention of their friends and members of the community as a whole to the disorder, so that everyone starts talking about this disorder, which is causing so much trouble.
Mrs. Lorna Mellor, who is a sort of a grandmother of diabetes in Australia, she set up the first parents group, and again has been a driving force to get the psychological impact of diabetes recognised by families.
There was no mechanism to know any other parent who spoke the same language of hypoglycemia, syringes, needles, food. I had no contact with anybody else who understood my language. My husband Brian and I started the parent group, and it was under the auspices of the old Diabetic Association of New South Wales, which is now the council, and we asked permission to start a parent group within that, because up until then there was absolutely nothing that separated children and parents out. It took off like a rocket. Well, my basic idea was, what's new, what can we use, how can we use this now? And in 1992 it became the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation.
Dr. Ted Craig I've known for many, many years as a scientist at the Garvan, and again, the Garvan has done an enormous amount to contribute, particularly in type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, and Ted's been the scientist leading that program. Great guy. Professor Don Chisholm is a real star in Australia and globally. We've worked together on many projects since the 70s, and I have the utmost admiration for him.
When I started off, I was really intent on being a physician in private practice. I wasn't specially interested in the research side, but I wanted to understand how the hormone assays worked, so I got involved and sort of accidentally got involved in research. And 45 years later, here I am, still at it. We developed a centre here, which was opened in 1980, and took an extra step, undertake all diabetes management on an ambulatory basis. You didn't get into hospital with diabetes unless you were very seriously ill. Use of beds in the hospital went from an average of 7 beds for patients with diabetes to an average of 0.7 beds.
Professor Dennis Yu, Dennis, has been my boss since 1986, and he is very well recognised in Australia for setting up innovative models of care. Over the years he's contributed an enormous amount in innovative ambulatory care services and clinical research. So Professor Martin Schilling, he was the first paediatric endocrinologist in Australia, and he set up the endocrine department at the Children's Hospital.
And it was just this general progression of recognising that as a doctor you can do a tremendous amount for individual families, but if you try to involve a greater amount of change for a greater number of people, you had to step up and work with a larger horizon.
One of his great achievements was to have a resolution passed at the United Nations. Only one other health resolution had been passed previously, and that was in HIV/AIDS. And so what Martin contributed was unbelievable. And that work has continued since that time. And now governments around the world are starting to sit up and take diabetes seriously.
This is just acknowledged traditional owners, the Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander elders past and present, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within the nation.
Diabetes is widespread in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and is not simply lifestyle and genetic factors. For decades, there was no access to treatment or education, despite insulin being available in the wider community.
Certainly up until the late 70s probably, when the AMSs first came out to address the inequalities, for a number of Aboriginal people, diabetes certainly wasn't well understood. It was a death sentence, as it is probably in some regards today.
My grandmother, she died as a result of diabetes. My brother, who was 4 years older than I am, I've been diagnosed with it.
My mother was a diabetic, and all her sisters, and later on in life all of her brothers end up with diabetes as well. the whole lot, and they're all deceased now. My father, he came into my life and he had diabetes, and I went over to visit him and they said he's in a diabetic coma and he never came out. Like Aboriginal seems to have these sicknesses and diseases more than non-Aboriginal, and it just, I don't know, it's just got me bamboozled.
Well, the gene, the diabetes gene, is there in the Aboriginal community, and the lifestyle, particularly in the urbanised Aboriginal person, is such that it's conducive to the development of hyperglycemia. An unfortunate combination of the genetic susceptibility and the environment.
We also certainly have a number of people with type 2 diabetes that require insulin at the moment as well.
Heroes emerged who worked hard for Aboriginal people to understand the problem, find treatment and change the situation.
There was a time when the community leader was Mum Shirl, and she was an extraordinary person and extremely valuable within that community in identifying people who needed help.
You've only got to go look the who's to who when you start looking at where the Aboriginal medical services came through and came from. Oh yeah, look, there's ladies like Dulcie Flower, Naomi down at Redfern, you know, like the people like Steve Blundens and even your Bobby Davises that started up AMSs, were part of AMSs and carried them through. I mean, the elders from this community here who lobbied to actually get the AMS up, they're actually acknowledged in the waiting room here in photos and tributes for what they were able to do to get the AMSs up and running, for the simple fact there was an inequality in Aboriginal care. So yeah, look, there's so many champions when you start looking across Australia what have actually been done, who's been involved, and they continue to actually carry that fight forward. That self-management is probably one of the biggest issues when you're looking at education and support for a patient that you can have, and the more that you can empower people, the better off they're going to be, and their families in that regard. The simple fact is, I suppose from my point of view as a diabetes educator, we're not going to be made redundant through our workload, for the simple fact it's a growing source of chronic ill health, and that's something that has to be addressed, and it's something that you want to think to yourself, well, what sort of a dent are we making in this?
So discrimination is still a problem, and I think you need to distinguish between what are safety issues where someone with diabetes can't fill that position. A pilot of a passenger aeroplane would be such an example. However, in the past there's been a tendency to exclude people with diabetes from a whole lot of jobs which they should have been able to do and could do.
And so, as a response, various pieces of legislation were introduced to prevent discrimination against people on a whole range of areas, one of them being disability. We do fall within the coverage of that legislation, which means that people are not lawfully able to discriminate against you on the grounds of disability unless there's a valid reason to do so.
And the first employment I got was with the Postmaster General's department in Sydney. And I passed a physical to get into the Postmaster General's, and they said I was fine. And I just happened to mention to somebody about 3 or 4 months down the track that I was a diabetic, and all hell broke loose. And they said, oh, you can't work here. You can't have superannuation if you're a diabetic. And I was dismissed from the PMG.
There was a gentleman who had been a nurse, and he'd been a nurse for some years and done shift work and so on, and that had been very successful. And he was someone with insulin-dependent diabetes, no problems. And he decided he would like to be an ambulance officer. Now, to become an ambulance officer, there was a whole recruitment process, and there were various stages which he completed successfully. And then it got to a stage close to the end of the process where you had to have a medical. Well, obviously, as part of the medical, it came out that he had type 1 diabetes, and he at that stage was rejected for going any further in the process. He challenged it. The argument that the ambulance service put forward was If you're looking after patients, timing might be absolutely crucial, and if you were distracted by having to deal with a hypo, for example, that could compromise patient safety. Now, taking all those things into account, the court decided that he had been discriminated against because in this particular case, his situation was well controlled. His doctor was very supportive of his ability to undertake these sorts of tasks, and he succeeded.
It was a case of a Qantas steward who had type 1 diabetes and wanted to be able to continue to fly and work as a steward, and the case went to the High Court, and I turned up to give evidence there, and a very eminent Australian diabetologist was in the witness box when I arrived saying why he shouldn't be allowed to fly, and the barrister for Qantas really got stuck into me, and at the end of a whole barrage of questions and comments said, but Professor Chisholm, you do realise the person before you giving witness is very eminent internationally and spoke to the last World Diabetes Congress. And I said, yes. He spoke to the last World Diabetes Congress about the epidemiology of diabetes, and I spoke about the management of diabetes. And his questioning ceased, and the Qantas steward won his case.
Now, it's interesting that in a couple of these instances, we've got bodies which are probably required to give a reason for a decision. In the real world, of course, people often don't say. So what's the best thing, it seems to me, looking at all these situations that have happened? Well, first is make sure your diabetes is as well controlled as you can get it to be. So be as healthy as you can be, has to be the first one. The second one, it seems to me as well, is have a very good relationship with your doctor, because your doctor may be able to really go in and bat for you if, you know, you do get into one of these situations. And then the third one, I think, is that, you know, I guess put on your flak jacket and have a bit of personal resilience and ability to fight for yourself if you need to.
I was first diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in my early 30s, about 34 years of age.
I actually got diagnosed when I was playing professional football after I had a major surgery.
Yes, I was diagnosed as an insulin-dependent diabetic at the age of 15.
In my mid-30s, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. At the time of diagnosis, I just opened a beautiful, beautiful restaurant. I was under a lot of financial pressure, a lot of emotional pressure. My wife had just had our first child. It was a particularly stressful time of my life.
Emotionally, I didn't understand what it was all about because I was a 10-year-old kid, and what's diabetes to a 10-year-old kid?
When my husband had the massive stroke, I think the stress of that brought it on, and it came back that I had type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, when I got told, my first reaction was pretty much, can I still play football? Obviously, doing the thing that I love and I've always grown up doing.
Once I was diagnosed with diabetes, it brings everything into focus, and people do tend to sort of panic a little bit about what's happening with diabetes. And it is a long-term disease, and nothing really happens immediately.
I thought, a pill, I can take a pill, I'll be fine.
And then you think, well, I'll beat this in the next 3 months, and then you realise that that doesn't quite happen. And I was told by all and sundry or people around me that I'd be dead in 3 years. And I thought, well, the hell with you, I'm going to live my life, and I did.
Once I found out that I could still play football, just learnt as much as I could about diabetes, and now obviously still playing 4 years on.
And it's taken a long while to sort of understand what it really is and work out where I'm going and what I need to do.
For me, that was the real catalyst to wanting to play rugby for Australia. It was the thing that really set me on the pathway. I can recall vividly, and I think about it often, when I was 15 and I first went to the endocrinologist, and he said to me, I don't think rugby's the go for you. And I can remember sitting there and walking out of his office as a 15-year-old and saying, I'll show you one day, because I'll play rugby for Australia.
I worked recently on a single for a band called Gautier that was called Somebody That I Used to Know, and it became a massive international hit. And as a result of my work on that in the post-production, I won a Grammy Award. So when they announced that we'd won, I had to bolt for the stage. So That's a good reason to keep your sugars just a hair above low. In any stressful situation, you may need just that little bit of extra to get you somewhere. So that's my advice.
Whilst I run a beautiful restaurant and work in kitchens and are surrounded by temptation all of the time, I still have to have a very focused approach on what I eat and the times that I eat food. So I've written 2 books. The first book was called Blood Sugar, and the second book's called Blood Sugar, the Family, and they've both been hugely successful. And I think you're going to see a massive change in restaurants over the coming years where chefs start to care about the health of their diners rather than just the flavour that they're giving them.
I ended up getting picked for the Wallabies in 1999 against the All Blacks in a Bledisloe Cup test. And I can remember standing in the middle of Stadium Australia, as it was then at the time. It was a crowd of 109,742 people. And I can remember belting out the national anthem and thinking about that moment when I was a 15-year-old back in the endocrinologist's office. And that was the thing that I thought about at the time.
There is a worldwide epidemic, certainly with type 2 diabetes, and it's linked to obesity and inactivity and a poor or a highly processed diet or even a high GI diet. So if you're in that bracket, do something about it now. Take the initiative now, because if you're diagnosed as a diabetic, once those words come out of your doctor's mouths, your life changes and you have an illness that will be with you 24/7 for as long as you live.
I think try and accept it first up, and if you can accept it, get on with life. I've got to keep moving. I've got to keep up with the grandkids. You know, they're just too active.
In actual fact, you treat yourself as a diabetic. The doctor doesn't treat you, you treat yourself. All the doctor does is monitor what you're doing at home. Treat yourself as you would your car. If you've got a good car, you want to look after it, look after it. Your body's the same.
Going forward, it's all me now. It's all up to me. I've got to do the right things.
Do something about it today. Take it seriously and take the initiative to learn something about it yourself.
It is a disease that's absolutely manageable. People live normal lives, yet their lives are enormously impacted.
70 years ago, I would have just been a memory of some guy who got to the age of 19 and then was just gone. So really, I've got a free pass into life, courtesy of scientific research. So why wouldn't I use that pass?
Hello. I trust you've enjoyed this retrospective and have a deeper insight into the significant advances in the treatment and management of diabetes in Australia over the past 75 years. As a nation, we have truly revolutionised the lives of people living with diabetes, and I have no doubt we will continue to do so. In putting this tribute together, it was impossible to acknowledge every individual who contributed to the significant advances we have just heard about. So to all those who've been part of that revolution for people living with diabetes and their family and friends, thank you. We proudly remain the shared voice of diabetes and will not rest until we find a cure that ensures diabetes associations in Australia and across the world no longer need to exist. So thank you again for being part of the journey so far, and thank you in advance for all the invaluable support I know you will give in the future.